Today we're going to be talking a little bit about verbs. Now, what are verbs? Verbs are actions. They're what makes the world move. And teaching verbs is something that you can't take for granted. You have to do it in a very systematic way. Verbs are an essential part of enabling students to speak English in a natural and meaningful way. Teachers following a set curriculum with an assigned textbook may find that the verbs, as they're presented in the textbook, are in a very unusual, ineffective, and non-communicative manner, that the way they're laid out. And it is then up to that teacher to teach the verb form systematically. Verbs that need to be mastered are found by searching which verbs are included in the yearly assigned textbook, which is basically the yearly assigned curriculum. Typically, a teacher will have 1 year to complete one textbook from page 1 until the last page. And that's pretty much set. Now, in addition, and no less important, are the verbs that are used, what we would call classroom English. Some people call it basic patterns for communication, teacher-student communication. These verb patterns that are used in the classroom management, communication between the teacher and the student. And Japanese don't typically use these very well. They like to conduct their class completely in Japanese and save the target language, which is English, only for what they are teaching, the aim of the lesson that day. So often classroom English is just pushed by the side, and I think that is to a serious disadvantage to the students, because classroom English verb patterns must be integrated as a natural means for students and teachers to communicate during that management of the class, because the acid test of whether the student grasps or understands these verbs, at least in the listening sense, is if the teacher says something and the students do. If the teacher says look at the board and the students look at the board. If the teacher says sit down and everybody sits down. Okay, this shows that they either understand at that point or they're certainly on their way to understanding. So that should not be ignored. Okay, now there's several points I want to talk about. When you're teaching verbs to first-year students, for the purpose of this training, we're going to go with first-year junior high school students under the assumption that this is their first exposure to English in a curriculum. First point is the root infinitive forms are taught first, and they're best taught beginning with those classroom commands that the teachers ignore, because these classroom commands are something a teacher and student will use in a daily setting. They're very natural. Of course, there are the verbs as they follow the sequence of the course or the textbook. Like play baseball, watch TV, go to school. But no matter what verb forms you're teaching, no attempt should be made at this time to teach any other form of the verb except for the infinitive form, the root form. Do not attempt to teach past tense at this point. Do not attempt to teach continuous tense or anything else. Only the root form should be practiced for now, and these might include things like sit down, look at the board, give me your paper, write this down, repeat after me. Very famous, repeat after me. Second point I'd like to mention is the use of Japanese. I use Japanese very sparingly. I am fluent in Japanese, but I do not use very much of it in the class. The use of Japanese for the purpose of students understanding the definitions is not useful at the initial point, in my opinion. Other teachers may disagree, but that's what makes us teachers, and I'm open to peer review. I like to be criticized because it has me revisit some of my methods, and this is how I improve as a teacher. I've been doing it for 20 years. I don't know everything, and I'm still learning. But in my 20 years experience, I've observed consistently that students that have the meaning beforehand in their own language, they tend to have more to think about uh, after studying these meanings and of all these new words, and they get a lot of vocabulary, more than I would give them actually. They tend to really throw the vocabulary out very fast in the textbooks. Uh, and if they get the meaning prior, they tend to repeat and orally drill the new verbs much slower and just very awkward, out of rhythm. It's really hard to control a class of 40 people. Everybody's doing a different speed, so it's kind of a classroom management problem for me. So first, I think it's best to follow the introductory exercise very slowly, very gradually, and reserve the use of Japanese, excuse me, until after the students have had sufficient choral repetition practice and achieved native speed and natural sounding speech. I know that sounds very lofty. Then I'll do the meaning check by asking things like, what does sit down mean in Japanese? What does look at the board mean in Japanese? And I'll even ask them in Japanese. Sit down. 日本語どういう意味ですか？はい。はい。あ、座りなさい。はい。そうです。That's right. Of course, I'll use some Japanese, but it'll be at the end of the lesson. The final point is the overall sequence of the verbs throughout the school year takes the following 4 conditions into consideration. Number 1, the verbs in the order they're presented in the assigned textbook. This is something you don't have control over because you have to follow the textbook sequentially. Students basically have to be at the same point. Second point is the students should preferably be introduced orally, at least, and have practiced orally the verbs before they are presented in the textbook, because once you open the textbook and you got the blackboard out, the teacher is presenting the Japanese meanings, and it goes back to what I said before, like let's reserve the Japanese meaning until we kind of build up the rhythm. Third point is we have to teach the verbs that are found to be needed in the normal course of communication. The normal course of communication means they don't fall into the textbook, but by the way, we have to say that. We have to say close the door. We have to say open the window. It's hot or something in here. So these will come up. And the fourth point are verbs that fit in the desired sentence pattern sequencing order, which we will talk about in the second part of the verbs session. So this is broken down into 2. So please tune in for part 2, and we're going to talk about our sentence pattern sequencing that we will practice the verbs in.